Hey everyone, welcome back from what was hopefully a relaxing Thanksgiving break. At least you didn't have things that were due last week, so that makes it a little bit relaxing, right? We are rounding out the semester here with these final two modules. This week we're going to be talking about multicultural counseling theories, and then next week I'm going to be posting information that'll take you outside of eCampus and will help you focus on integrated behavioral counseling approaches. And it's a module, if you will, that Dr. Glenn developed for a grant that she's working on specific to working with individuals with a history of opioid use, people that are in recovery, and it's a nice little module I think that'll be useful for you guys, but we wanted to make sure that we're putting that information out too. So that there really shouldn't be that much more in terms of work that you need to be doing, although we've got the theories paper, the theoretical orientation paper coming up as well, and hopefully, again, that'll be something that's just a modification of what you guys already wrote in 501. So let's get into multicultural counseling, okay? So we got a lot of slides here for you and a lot of content. The textbook, as you can see, did not include a chapter on multicultural counseling. Can't really tell you why Corey decided not to do that, but there are other textbooks that do. So I pulled all of this from a textbook that I've used before in the past, the references at the end, Wedding and Corsini. That's a great text that I like to reference. But so when we think about multicultural counseling, you know, obviously we are all practicing in a multiculturally competent manner, right? And that ensures that we are following our ethical guidelines, whether it's ACA or CRCC or whatever else you want to be following. So all counselors should be multiculturally competent, right? And we do things to work to make sure that we are multiculturally competent. But multicultural counseling is different. So there are individuals that, just like you might be saying that your theoretical orientation is CBT or Adlerian or psychoanalytic if you feel like it, whatever it is, there are people out there, counselors, therapists out there that identify as multicultural counselors. And so within this counseling approach, it's not only recognizing diversity, the importance and of acknowledging diversity and the complexities of diversity, pulling in a lot of the stuff that comes from the social justice background and feminism, historical, cultural, economic, socio-political context that play out in the lives of our clients and their lived experiences. But these are specific approaches, ways that counselors are practicing. They're modifying their techniques, they're modifying their approaches, or they're following specific culturally focused counseling modes that are specific for that culture that they're working with. So just keep an open mind to what that might be like, because, you know, as you'll see later in the slides, there's not one specific type of way that somebody is a multicultural counselor. It just depends. The counselor's role depends 100% really on the culture of the individual that the person is working with. And, you might see individuals that practice from a multicultural standpoint living in specific areas throughout the United States, for example, or practicing outside of the United States, where you see kind of those larger populations of a specific culture, within that area. Like somebody living in the Midwest might be more focused on the indigenous cultures out there, or somebody that's working in Alaska obviously is going to be, focusing their attention to the indigenous people of Alaska, which those cultures look different depending on where somebody might be. So, to a degree, I would argue just a touch that, if you're practicing in rural Appalachia, that's a culture in and of itself too, because there's certain specific attributes of that group of individuals that really identify as Appalachian that are unique to them, unique to that cultural group. So with that, I'm not going to go kind of through the history of multiculturalism in counseling. We do that, and you're going to have the cultural issues course, and I feel like I harp a lot on the fact that counseling just didn't do any type of job, way back when, in identifying the importance of culture. It was kind of like hey, if you're a good counselor, you're a good counselor, and it doesn't matter that you know or don't know about your client's cultural background, their historical background, how they identify in various different ways. And there are people that still practice that do kind of have that belief system, and that to me is up to them, and that's fine. But obviously, because of our ethical guidelines and the importance and the role of cultural issues in counseling, it's important to talk about the history of it. And so there are a number of different kind of big players in the multicultural counseling world. COUN are a couple that you will probably hear about, if not use their text in the cultural issues course. RATS is another one, Dr. RATS. And so a lot of the information that you might see that's related to cultural issues comes from both of them. Or well, all three of those individuals, I should say. But so Sue and Sue kind of proposed that there are these three scientific models that have perpetuated stereotypes when it comes to providing counseling in a cultural way. One is that they're, individuals that hold some type of minority status are deficient because their genes are deficient. And so that is the crux of the pathological issues that somebody might bring to us. The culturally deficient model is that the culture is to blame for the pathology. So the culture that person has grown up in, that's what we would blame, right? And kind of the third one, the inferiority or pathological model, minorities are on the lower part of the evolutionary scale and therefore are not as developed as their white counterparts, and that is the issue in terms of maladjustment, pathological issues, and things of that nature. We know that these things aren't true, right? They perpetuate stereotypes, and it can be our role to educate others, whether it's in our community or even in our counseling agency, if people do hold these types of outdated beliefs that directly can impact the client populations that we work with. So that's kind of the history of it. Now, in terms of counseling, we've adopted a culturally diverse model. We could think of multicultural competence and multicultural counseling as being the fourth force in counseling. I know we talked about kind of these forces in counseling earlier on in the semester with psychoanalytic, psychodynamic kind of being that first force. Then we had humanistic and behavioral counseling approaches. And then the fourth one, a pretty big gap really in between the humanistic force in counseling, if you will, and multicultural counseling, but nevertheless, we saw, in the 90s, I would say, that there was this increased emphasis on multicultural theories, multicultural counseling, multicultural competence. That's when we saw the inclusion of multicultural competence in codes of ethics, course development, KCREP and CORE, both saying that it had to be that cultural issues courses needed to be part of the curriculum and infused throughout. Saw it on exams also. And now there's even a set of, which is relatively new, 2015, they came out with specific dedicated multicultural counseling competencies. So that's like a dedicated list of ways that we can be competent as counselors or multicultural counselors. So that's a lot, right? But I'm not going to go through kind of the breakdown of what we mean by culture. We don't just mean culture. We are also including race, racial diversity, ethnicity, minority status of any type. Disability could potentially fall under that umbrella as well. Specifically, if you're thinking about certain groups of individuals with a specific type of disability, like the deaf culture, capital DEAF culture, there are certainly groups of individuals that strongly identify as a cultural group. So kind of thinking about what multicultural competence looks like really resides in four different areas: our attitudes and beliefs, and that is a matter of us starting to address our own values, our biases, where they come from, working to identify them when they pop up, and working to change them if they are outside of what they should be, essentially, and understanding that our lives and our worldview is all has been developed because of how we have lived, right? The influences that we've experienced in our lives. Knowledge around the worldview of a client, what that worldview might look like, and knowledge to develop cognitive empathy, and because that's kind of the basis and foundation of being a multicultural counselor and being multiculturally competent. If you're identifying with a different orientation, right? Developing cognitive empathy, the knowledge and the skills, the attitudes and beliefs, all of that kind of is what we're hoping to develop in you all as students. The action part of it comes into play whenever you hit practicum and internship. So kind of moving into what the skills might be, right? Because this is something where it's like, well, we could see with CBT, what those worksheets look like. We can see with solution focused, what a process should look like. We see with motivational interviewing that there's like a step-by-step system for actually counseling somebody, with different stages, and that comes into play with a lot of the different theoretical orientations out there. When we think of multicultural counseling, like I said, the role of the counselor is going to be very dependent on the culture of the people that they're working with. But empathy, of course, is kind of a mainstay in all of it. So we're developing empathy for the other, which means that I, as a white middle class, relatively educated woman, I cannot understand what a Syrian refugee that has landed in Pittsburgh, because there's a good population of individuals from the Middle East in Pittsburgh. I can't understand what they've gone through. I have not done that. I have not been a refugee. But I can empathize, and I can do that by learning about the experience of a client, trying to understand the reasons why they felt like they were needing to leave when they left, and the impact that had on their family, and any kind of religious or political influences, not any, like what they were, but so recognizing that my client's experience is unique, that I can't ever understand it, but I can empathize with it, right? Also recognizing kind of that ethnocultural transference and countertransference, and so that's, again, being very introspective and self-critical to say, is there a reason why I'm not offering the same service to my client that's a different cultural background than me? Some of this can come out through supervision, right? So if you're working with a client that does have a different status than you, right, identifies in a different way, and if you aren't as comfortable possibly in your practicum and internship, then in addressing that directly with your client, because that's one of the things we should be doing, is asking our client how they feel about the fact that we're of a different culture, then you could be exploring all of that in your supervision as well. So there are 3 models that I wanted to present to you in this lecture today of multicultural theory and practice, okay? And I think they are a pretty good breakdown of how you could actually be using a lot of the multicultural practices, like in your actual practice, whether it be through adapting dominant psychotherapy, so whatever your preferred theoretical orientation might be, adapting that in a culturally appropriate way could be a way to become a multicultural counselor. Ethnic psychotherapies and holistic approaches are the other 2 models, if you will. You can find a lot of different references to models and frameworks of multicultural counseling out there. I'm not here to tell you one is better than the other, or that there's one that doesn't work and don't use it. That's not for me to do. But if this is something that interests you, or if you feel like you would be working with a specific culture down the road and you want to kind of tailor your approaches in a more cultural way, then certainly go out there and research some more. And hopefully you learn about this in the cultural class too. But so let's think about the cultural adaptation of a dominant psychotherapy. One of these could potentially be adapting cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, but it's really including these 8 cultural dimensions into whatever your orientation might be, considering language, the person, metaphors that might be useful in understanding from their culture, context of their lives and concepts, goals that might be unique to working with that cultural group, different methods that might be unique, and the context of counseling in and of itself. The second model, if you will, kind of the ethnic psychotherapies, we've learned about some of these, right? We've talked about narrative therapy. We've talked about, well, in a little bit of kind of the folk healing network. Well, I don't think we talked about network therapy, but folk healing a little bit in terms of the contemplative theories. Network therapy is where you are extending that therapeutic relationship beyond that individual or couple or even their biological family or relatives. So you might be extending it out to, like, let's say, a preacher or a pastor for somebody that's living in the South that really identifies strongly in a religious way. Maybe you're extending it out to natural healers in a person's tribe if you're working with somebody that's currently living, let's say, on a reservation. So you're extending your services and including more individuals within the counseling therapy or therapeutic relationship. Can be a little bit tricky in terms of ethics and confidentiality and things like that. But certainly if somebody's culture is not like it is here in America, right, where we're just all about ourselves, and they really do value the opinions of people around them that aren't just like their parents or their siblings or their spouse, then network therapy could be a way to include everybody. Ethnopsychopharmacology is the longest word that I think I ever have to refer to in counseling. So this is where you might be looking at how historically an individual from a different culture, how that culture might use natural medicine, might use plant-based medicines for treatment, and not just ruling those out, natural healing processes, not just ruling all of that out and saying that's not our modern medicine, we're not going to include that, but including some whatever might be part of that person's culture in terms of medicine that might not look like medicine that we get prescribed from our pharmacist, right? So moving on to the holistic approaches, a lot of these are what we talked about whenever that module on contemplative psychotherapies, right? So we are understanding that the attitudes, the behaviors of individuals are not viewed, but they're explained not only by their cultural identity, focusing on the spirit, the mind, the body, the interplay between spirituality, religion could be brought into this as well. And then kind of wrapping this up with, well, the assessment is one of them. One of the things I do want to talk about, kind of the 10 steps to a culturally responsive assessment. But if we think about, how we should be asking our clients these questions, and looking at Hayes, Pamela Hayes has this addressing framework, which I think is really useful. If we're looking at the intakes that we're doing on clients, sometimes it might be just kind of a checkbox type of thing, like a yes or no type of questionnaire for our clients. But a lot of times we can be asking more of these open-ended questions to gain a little bit more information about our client or the clients that are sitting across from us. So it may not be that we're just focusing on how old somebody is, but maybe their age in the context of generational influences. Are they a first generation American? Are they a first generation US citizen? Are they a citizen at all? What that plays out like in their life. Certainly we're ideally going to be looking at disability status, but this could also extend to individuals that are in their circle, and do they have a child with a disability, and how is that factoring into the overall situation. Looking at religion and spiritual orientation as two separate things, ethnic and racial identity, how somebody identifies, maybe, again, not just checking one box, but leaving it an open-end question. How do you identify? Looking at socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, if that is part of the overall picture. National heritage is something different, and then gender, of course, as something different than sexual orientation, right? So ways that we can ask this, those open-ended questions. How do you describe yourself? Leaving it open-ended. What was your religious upbringing? Do you have an experience with disability? What did it mean to you to grow up as a male or female in your family, in your culture? What was that like? So there are also tools that we can be using and considering the cultural genogram, which I feel like you guys should remember, right? Doing those genograms, family genograms, and considering kind of a full-blown like ethnocultural assessment where you're looking at, where you're really asking more dedicated questions about a person's heritage, their ancestry, the history of their culture, potentially going even further on your own in terms of learning more about a person's culture, and considering cultural trauma as well. And not just cultural trauma, but the impact of multi-generational cultural trauma, which is also something that we need to be aware of as counselors too. Now, when we think about assessment in terms of the DSM, the DSM-5 has a nice cultural formulation outline that you can look at, and has even kind of put out there a cultural formulation interview. Now, in the DSM-4, there was the cultural formulation outline as well, and I think before that in the DSM-3, there wasn't really much mention of culture. So all of the ways in which we even look at the impact of culture on how we are diagnosing our clients is something relatively new in terms of counseling and psychotherapy. So, and they like hide it in the back sometimes. You kind of got to dig for it, but I encourage you to really look over that. So with that, I encourage you guys to, hopefully the video is working. I always hope these videos are working, but I went ahead and included a multicultural counseling session for you to view. And so, you know, as always, you know, I can't require you. I don't know how I would require you to watch all of it, but I encourage you to watch a good majority of it. I did put a book chapter up as well that talks about the multicultural movement as the fourth force, since we didn't have a book chapter to reference for this week. And so I hope you find it all interesting, and it kind of, you know, sparks an interest in how you can incorporate some of these tools and techniques into your practice. So with that, I'll leave you all to it, and we'll get back together on the discussion board, okay?